Okay, so you're tuned in, ready for the deep dive. Let's jump right in. We're tackling a McKinsey Global Institute report today, and this one's a biggie.
Yeah, it's called Dependency and Depopulation, and it's about as straightforward as it sounds, confronting a new demographic reality. No sugarcoating here.
Definitely not. It gets right to the heart of how global populations are changing, fewer births, longer lives, all that. And it spells out some pretty serious potential consequences. Economic, societal, the whole nine yards. This report is dense, data-packed, projections galore.
Our mission today,
Mm-hmm.
distilling it down, we'll pull out the key takeaways, the stuff you really need to know without overwhelming you.
Exactly. Let's make it digestible. So first things first, right? Fertility rates.
Right. And we need to be clear, when we talk about fertility here, we're not talking about whether someone can have children. We're talking about how many children women are having, on average. That's the demographer's view.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And to get a real handle on this, they use this thing called the total fertility rate. Basically, it's like saying, imagine a woman lives through her entire childbearing years, and at every age, she has children at the rate women that age are having them right now. How many kids would she end up with?
Exactly. It's projecting a lifetime average based on current trends. And then there's this super important benchmark called the replacement level fertility rate. It's about 2.1 children per woman, according to the UN. Think of it this way. Roughly the average needed for a generation to replace itself, one for one. Of course, it fluctuates a bit depending on things like child mortality rates, sex ratios at birth, that kind of thing.
So bottom line for our listeners, if a country's fertility rate dips below 2.1 consistently, and barring huge migration waves, their population is probably going to shrink over time. Obviously, the short-term picture depends on how many women are of childbearing age right now and, how long people are living.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, this report doesn't really dive deep into why fertility rates are changing. There's a ton of research out there on that. Folks like Alvarez, Eberstadt, and Evans have done some fascinating work.
Right, tons of theories.
This McKinsey report is laser-focused on the economic consequences of this downward trend. What does it mean for growth, for jobs, for everything, really?
Right, so big picture, what's the situation globally?
Well, it's pretty widespread. Fertility rates are dropping pretty much everywhere. Advanced economies, those in Asia, Europe, North America, they were already below replacement level by the early 1990s. China hit that point in 91, Thailand even earlier in 89. Mexico in 2015, India just recently in 2019. It's a trend.
Wow, okay. So any exceptions to this rule?
The big one. Sub-Saharan Africa, their fertility rates are still high, and projections show them staying above replacement level for at least the next 25 years. So yeah, a global trend, but with very different regional stories.
Absolutely. And of course, it's not just about birth rates. People are also living longer.
Much longer. Global life expectancy has gone up by an average of 7 years since 1997. It's 73 now, projected to reach 77 by 2050. And you know what the fastest growing age group is, percentage-wise?
I'm guessing centenarians.
You got it. People over 100. Incredible.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. But the report makes this really interesting point. While longer lifespans are grabbing headlines, the real driver behind these demographic shifts is falling fertility. It accounts for something like 80% of the changes in population structure in developed countries since 1960.
80%. Think about that.
That's huge. So it's not just about living longer, it's about fewer people being born in the first place.
And they illustrate this perfectly with Germany. Between 1960 and 2021, they had 26 million fewer births than they would have if fertility rates stayed constant.
26 million, that's almost a third of their current population.
Exactly. Longer lifespans added about 7 million seniors, but the net effect was a population 23% smaller than it would have been a difference of roughly 19 million people.
Wow. Okay, so we've got fewer young people, more older people. What does that mean in terms of, workforce and who's supporting whom?
That's where the concepts of working age population and support ratio come in. Working age is usually defined as 15 to 64, and the support ratio is how many people in that age group there are for every person 65 and older.
Right, because those 65 and older are mostly retired, relying on pensions, government services, and so on. And remember, in a lot of countries, pension eligibility starts between 60 and 67, so that senior group is getting bigger faster.
Exactly. The report highlights this. It's not just about numbers on a page. That drop in global support ratio from 6.5 to 3.9, that could mean higher taxes or fewer benefits down the line.
Makes you think. And the report points out that even if, magically, every country's fertility rate jumped back to 2.1 overnight, it would still take about 20 years for those babies to grow up, join the workforce, start contributing. There's a lag built in.
Absolutely. It's not a quick fix. And to understand the timeline of this shift, the report breaks it down into first waves and later wave regions.
Okay, so who's in the first wave?
Think developed economies,
Hmm.
advanced Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, North America, Western Europe, plus Greater China, which, demographically speaking, acts a lot like the first wave, even though its income levels are different.
Got it. And the later wave.
That's where the shift is just starting or hasn't really hit yet. Places like India, Bangladesh, Brazil, Egypt, Mexico.
Okay, so what we're seeing play out in Europe and Asia now, that's coming for the rest of the world eventually.
That's the trajectory, yeah. And that has implications for everything. Global trade, economic relationships, you name it.
Definitely something to watch. Now, before we get too deep, let's be transparent about the data here.
Yeah, the report pulls from a whole range of sources. The UN's World Population Prospects, of course, the National Transfer Accounts Project, labor stats from organizations like the ILO, the Conference Board, figures from Eurostat, OECD, national statistics offices. It's comprehensive.
Thorough. But even with all that, predicting population is tricky, right? There's uncertainty.
Absolutely. Demographers have different opinions, and projections from groups like the IHME, the IASA, they might paint a slightly different picture. Even the UN's own projections have a huge range for global population in 2100.
And of course, there's migration, always a wild card. Unlike fertility and lifespan, which change gradually, migration can shift really suddenly. Economic boom, political crisis, climate disaster, you name it.
Right, it's a big variable.
So keeping those uncertainties in mind, what's the report saying about the first wave?
Well, their working age populations have already peaked, and the decline is happening now. Average total fertility rate is only 1.2 kids per woman, and about 67% of their population's working age. That's down from a peak of 70% in 2010. Projections say that could fall to 59% by 2050.
59%, that's a significant drop.
It is. And even within the first wave, there's variation. Germany's working age peak happened earlier than in the US or China. China's decline is projected to be steeper because their fertility and migration are lower.
It's interesting, the report gets really granular, even showing differences within countries. Like, the US in 2022, South Dakota's fertility rate was 2.01, basically replacement level. But in Washington, D.C., it was only 1.24.
Huge difference. And in India, between 2019 and 2021, Bihar's rate was 2.98, while Sikkim's was just 1.05. Really highlights how diverse things can be, even within one country.
Absolutely. Now, the big concern here is that support ratio, right? How many working age folks for every senior?
Yeah, globally it's projected to drop from 6.5 to 3.9 by 2050, but in the first wave it's even more drastic, from 3.9 down to 2.
So in the first wave, by 2050, there'll be only 2 people working for every retiree.
That's what the projections say. And by then, advanced Asia, Greater China, and Western Europe will have the lowest ratios. It really makes you think about the long-term stability of their economies and social safety nets.
It's a lot of weight for those 2 workers to carry, and later wave regions, they're not off the hook, are they?
No, not at all. Their support ratios are also going down, from 10.3 today to 5.7 by 2050. India, for example, goes from 9.8 now to about half that by 2050, then all the way down to 1.9 by 2100. That's where Japan is now.
Wow, that's a fast decline. And we're talking total population peaks too, right?
Yeah, the first wave's total population actually peaked in 2020. It's projected to go from 2.8 billion now to 2.6 billion by 2050, then 1.9 billion by 2100. There are already 37 first-wave countries where more people are dying than being born each year.
More deaths than births. That's pretty stark.
It is, and it means a big shift in global population distribution. By 2100, less than 20% of the world's people will be living in first-wave regions, while sub-Saharan Africa's share will grow significantly.
So big changes ahead. But what does all this shrinking population actually mean for those first-wave countries?
Well, the report suggests 26 of them could see their populations shrink by a third or more by 2100, and some, like China, Poland, South Korea, could lose half their population, or even more.
Oh, exceptions to that.
A few. France, the UK, the US, they might see some growth thanks to continued net migration.
So migration makes a difference.
It can. The report also gets into the impact of really low fertility. They use this example. Imagine a country with a constant rate of 0.7, like South Korea's now. In just 2 generations, you'd have only 13 grandchildren for every 100 grandparents.
That's a tiny next generation.
Exactly. Makes you think about how you'd fund schools, manage debt, ensure social services, even maintain global power balances. Some argue that smaller populations are good for the environment, but NGI's research suggests sustained economic growth is actually crucial for a successful transition to net zero emissions.
So it's not a simple equation. Now, I'm curious, the report does this thought experiment, the replacement floor hypothetical.
Ah, yes. This imagines all countries currently below 2.1 births per woman magically hit that rate in 2024 and stay there.
And what happened?
Well, the long-term effects are huge. By 2050, global population would be 10.2 billion instead of 9.6 billion. By 2100, it's 12.6 billion versus 10.2 billion. Advanced Asia, in particular, would have a population 1.6 times bigger in 2100.
So even a small increase in fertility can have a major impact long term.
Absolutely. And those support ratios would look a lot healthier. First wave regions could have a ratio of 2.2 by 2100 instead of 1.4 under the main projection.
Okay, so we've laid out the demographic landscape. What does it mean for the economy? The report paints a picture of this lower growth, higher dependency future, right?
Yeah, exactly. More older people, fewer working age folks. That naturally leads to slower economic growth. It's basic math. How much an economy grows per person depends mostly on how many hours people work and how productive they are during those hours.
So more workers generally means more growth, assuming they're productive.
In a nutshell, yes. Now, to analyze this, they make this key assumption. Labor intensity, meaning how much people in different age groups tend to work, stays at 2023 levels. This isolates the impact of the changing age mix itself.
Smart way to do it. So what does this look like in the real world?
We'll take Western Europe. From 1997 to 2023, more women and older folks joined the workforce, so labor intensity actually grew by 0.4% annually. But because the population was aging, thanks to lower fertility, the changing age mix reduced growth by about 0.3% a year. Productivity grew by 0.8%, leading to overall GDP per capita growth of 1%.
So they were growing, but slower than they would have been without the age shift.
Exactly. And the report stresses that this negative impact is only going to get stronger unless something changes.
So what are the options?
Well, people in different age groups could work more. We could see a huge productivity jump. Or the age mix itself could change due to shifts in fertility or migration that are different from what's projected.
Right, those are the big levers.
They are. And the next part of the report explores this in more detail. They look at target GDP per capita growth, which is basically the average growth a country or region has seen over the past 25 years. Then they ask, how much would productivity and labor intensity need to change to maintain that growth given the aging population?
Makes sense. Trying to figure out how to stay on track.
Right. They do adjust this target for China and South Korea because they were still emerging economies in 1997, so their past growth isn't necessarily a sustainable long-term target. China's adjusted target is 4.9% annual growth. South Korea's is 2%.
Okay, so they're factoring in that not every country can grow at breakneck speed forever.
Exactly. It's about being realistic. It's also worth noting that labor intensity tends to naturally decline as people get into their 50s. That's just a typical pattern.
Makes sense. You're not working at 60 the same way you did at 25.
Right. And the report has this fascinating sidebar about Japan. They experienced fertility decline early on, and they have the highest life expectancy in the world right now, 84 years. Back in 2005, 20% of their population was 65 or older. Now it's 30%.
Wow, that's a big jump.
It is. And even though they have a higher proportion of older people working, labor intensity still goes down with age. 25 to 64-year-olds work 30 hours a week on average. 65 and older work just 7.
7 hours a week. That's a big difference.
It is, and this is what the report's getting at. This aging population structure means the age mix is going to be a drag on how much people work, in those first wave regions especially. About 0.4% reduction annually, everywhere except North America.
Okay, so 0.4%, that doesn't sound huge.
So, but it adds up. They calculate that it's like a cumulative reduction of 2.2 hours per person per week across all first-wave economies between 2023 and 2050.
So less work, less growth.
Right. And they estimate that slowdown could mean $10,000 less per person in Western Europe, $6,000 less per person in Greater China over that period.
That's a significant hit. Okay, so let's look at the flip side. How has labor intensity actually changed recently?
Well, it increased in Western Europe from 1997 to 2023, but it went down in Greater China and Advanced Asia, stayed flat in North America and Central and Eastern Europe.
Interesting. So some places bucked the trend.
They did, and they found two groups whose labor intensity grew consistently in almost every region. Women 25 and older, except in Greater China, and people 50 and older. More older folks working, that's a trend.
It is, but even with that, overall labor intensity in most first-wave regions either stayed the same or fell, mainly because fewer people under 29 were working. Western Europe was the outlier. Their overall increase was enough to offset the aging impact.
Yeah, they're a bit of a special case. Spain is particularly interesting. Their average work week grew by 0.5% annually from 1997 to 2023, helping boost their GDP. Aging had a neutral impact.
So they were doing well, managing the age shift.
But the question is, can they sustain that? Female workforce participation is already high, and there are talks about shortening the work week.
Makes sense. You can't just keep squeezing more work out of people forever.
Right. And that brings us to the other big factor in economic growth: productivity. The report points out that improvements in how efficiently people work, that's been the biggest driver of GDP per capita growth in first-wave economies over the last 25 years.
So basically working smarter, not just harder.
Yeah. So if demographics are going to slow things down, something has to change. How much people work, how productive they are, or the age mix itself. And the report asks, by how much?
The million-dollar question.
Right. So they crunch the numbers, and they lay out what changes would be needed to maintain those past GDP per capita growth rates between 2023 and 2050. And the key finding is relying on just one of those levers is probably not enough. It's going to take a combination.
So I got to pull all the levers at once.
Pretty much. They use Germany as an example again. To maintain growth through increased labor intensity alone, they'd need people to work an extra 6.1 hours a week, mostly older folks. Or they'd need big increases in the number of 20 to 49-year-olds working, which they say might not be feasible.
So getting everyone to work more, that's not a realistic solution.
Not really. And that highlights the need to focus on productivity. The report says most first-wave countries need 1% to 2% annual productivity growth to keep up their past GDP per capita growth, assuming work hours stay constant. For Germany, that means doubling their average productivity growth from the last decade. Spain needs a four-fold increase. And if labor intensity doesn't budge, Germany needs 1.5%, Spain needs 1.9% annual productivity growth.
Those are ambitious targets.
They are. And China's got a unique challenge. Demographically, they're first wave, but their GDP per capita is more like the later wave. And they're aging fast because of low fertility. To meet their 4.9% growth target, they need a whopping 5.5% annual productivity growth.
Wow, that's a high bar, even for China.
It is. So the bottom line is, for most first-wave countries, it's going to take both increased labor intensity and big productivity gains to keep growth from slowing down too much. They show different combinations for Germany, using this idea of isoquants, different ways to achieve the same result.
Interesting. Different paths to the same destination.
Right. And they briefly touch on migration. They point out that if advanced economies wanted to keep their support ratios where they are now, just through migration, they might need half their populations to be foreign-born by 2050.
Half the population? That seems unlikely.
It does, yeah. Especially given the political realities around migration in many countries.
Okay, so slower growth in the first wave seems pretty much guaranteed. But what about the costs of all this? We got to talk about the societal bill for dependency, right?
Right. As people get older, they tend to consume more resources, both directly, like buying stuff, and indirectly, through things like healthcare, which are often government-funded. And at the same time, their income from work goes down, eventually stopping altogether when they retire. This creates a senior gap, the difference between what they consume and what they earn.
Someone's got to make up that difference.
Exactly. Either publicly through taxes on the working population or privately through savings and investments. And the report makes it clear, with more older people living longer, especially for those pension systems that promise specific benefits, the way we're funding things now probably isn't sustainable.
Yeah, something's got to give.
The report shows that in most first-wave regions, older folks actually consume a bit more, on average, than younger people, and this goes up as they age. In 2023, the 65 and older crowd had the highest per-person consumption in most first-wave regions. In Western Europe and advanced Asia, their direct spending was about 16% higher than average. Total consumption, including those government benefits, was even higher.
Okay, so they're spending more, and that means...
The total senior gap will grow across all first-wave economies. The U.S. is a good example. In 2023, the average senior gap per person 65 and older was about $60,000, combining direct spending and the value of government services.
$60,000 per person, that's a lot to cover.
It is. And by 2050, that total senior gap is projected to increase by 1.3 to 1.5 times across those regions. That puts a lot of pressure on public pensions, especially those pay-as-you-go systems funded by current workers' taxes, and on government-provided benefits like healthcare.
I'm seeing a theme here. Lots of pressure on existing systems.
Definitely. And the report dives into this with a sidebar about pensions. They point out that historically, pensions have been linked to societal stability. It's not a new issue.
No, definitely not.
They outline the three main types of pension systems: pay-as-you-go, defined contribution, and personal savings. Most developed countries have a mix of these. The U.S., for instance, has Social Security, which is pay-as-you-go, 401ks, which are defined contribution, and IRAs, which are personal savings.
Right, different ways to spread the risk, I guess.
And a lot of first-wave countries are already trying to reform their pensions. The Netherlands is shifting from defined benefit, where retirees are promised a specific amount, to defined contribution. China and a lot of OECD countries are raising retirement ages. Sweden links retirement age to life expectancy. France has made early retirement harder. Australia has mandatory private savings, called superannuation. And the U.S. recently bumped up IRA contribution limits.
So lots of different approaches. What seems to be working best?
It's hard to say. Every country has its own unique situation. To illustrate the pressure on governments, the report focuses on Spain, the UK, and the US. They have good data on government income and expenses by age, and they all have public pay-as-you-go pensions. In Spain, in 2023, seniors paid only 12% of taxes but used over 40% of government spending, mostly on pensions and healthcare. Meanwhile, the 36 to 45-year-olds, they paid 25% of taxes but used only 9% of spending.
So that intergenerational contract, younger folks supporting older folks, it gets strained when the balance shifts.
Exactly. And as that age mix changes, the report projects government deficits will go up as tax revenue falls and age-related spending rises. They say that by 2050, if things stay as they are, Spain's deficit per person could increase 4.5 times, the UK's could double, the US could see a 12% increase. Interestingly, the U.S. Congressional Budget Office, using more complex models, projects a 16% per capita increase.
So even the U.S., with its relatively healthy demographics compared to some, is facing a fiscal challenge.
No doubt. Now, the report also looks at how personal savings, and especially asset appreciation, particularly real estate, factor into this. Previous MGI research showed rising asset prices were a big driver of net worth growth in recent decades.
Right, so if your house goes up in value, you're better off even if your income doesn't change much.
Exactly. They focus on the U.S. here because wealth is very unevenly distributed. Older households, those headed by someone 65 or older, they hold 43% of total wealth, but they're only 20% of the population, and their wealth has grown much faster than for younger folks.
So older generations are doing well, financially speaking.
On average, yes. And real estate has been a big part of that. Almost 80% of older Americans own their homes, and 60% of those own them outright, no mortgage. Not paying rent frees up a lot of money. They can also downsize, access the equity they've built up.
Makes sense. Home ownership is a big part of the American dream.
Right. Other things have played a role, too, like stock market returns for folks with 401ks. But the report asks a key question. Can future retirees replicate this?
Good question. It seems tougher for younger folks these days.
It does. Housing costs are way up. The average single-family home in the U.S. is 6.6 times more expensive than in 1980. The price-to-income ratio has skyrocketed. Younger folks might face higher mortgages and higher taxes to support more retirees. They might inherit homes later in life. And there's no guarantee home prices will keep rising like they have, especially in areas with shrinking populations. Look at Japan. Real estate values haven't gone up much because of low population growth.
So the future might look very different for retirees.
It might. And that makes strong, sustainable public pensions all the more important, along with other solutions like boosting labor intensity, productivity, migration, and even encouraging higher fertility in the long run. It's a multifaceted problem.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the economic impact, the strain on public finances. What about the changes to the workforce and the consumer landscape?
That's where things get really interesting. The report calls this older workers, older consumers.
Yeah.
It's about adapting to a new reality.
Because the face of the workforce is changing, right?
Big time. By 2050, the over 65 crowd in first wave countries will be 29% of the population. That's up from 17% now and just 10% back in 1997. Businesses need to get ready for this.
They do. So how do they adapt?
Well, for one, they need to welcome the senior workforce, as the report puts it, rethink career paths, team structures, encourage lifelong learning, expand retraining for older workers. There's a lot of untapped potential there.
Right. Older workers bring experience, stability, all that.
Exactly. And it's not just about workers, it's about consumers too. Seniors are going to account for a bigger and bigger share of spending. Right now, they're about 21% of direct consumer spending in first-wave economies. By 2050, that's projected to be 31%, assuming spending patterns stay the same. In advanced Asia, it could be as high as 40%.
So businesses need to understand what older consumers want.
Absolutely. And the report says what is consumed will change. More demand for healthcare, wellness, less for education. Those categories are also heavily influenced by government-funded services, by the way. Like in Germany, total per capita healthcare spending is much higher when you factor in government-provided care.
Okay, so healthcare is going up, education down, any other big shifts?
They analyzed how spending changes throughout life, using data from China, Germany, Japan, and the US. Education spending drops off as people age, not surprisingly. And overall, healthcare spending is projected to rise the most due to demographics, while education spending will shrink the most.
Makes sense. Fewer kids, more seniors.
Right. The U.S. could see a $380 billion increase in healthcare spending by 2050 just from the age mix, while China could see a $465 billion decrease in education spending. Of course, other factors matter too, like overall population growth or decline and income changes.
Right, so it's not just demographics driving everything.
No, but the overall message is clear. Businesses in those first-wave countries need to adapt to these shifts in both their workforce and their customers. It's about staying competitive and mitigating that economic drag from demographic change.
Okay, so last but not least, the later wave. What's the outlook there?
Well, the same demographic shifts are happening, just with the time lag. The report calls this anticipating demographic shifts in later wave regions. Fertility rates are already below replacement in about a third of those countries, including India and much of Latin America. By 2050, another 32 later wave countries will join them, according to UN projections.
So the same pattern, just delayed.
Exactly. And the big exception is, again, sub-Saharan Africa. Their fertility rates are still high. But for everyone else, those support ratios are going to decline, and they've got limited time to prepare.
Time is of the essence.
Absolutely. The report stresses that these countries need to accelerate economic growth now to get ahead of the curve and support their aging populations down the line.
Easier said than done.
It is.
Yeah.
Reaching high income status before the aging really hits, that's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
The report uses Brazil and Bangladesh as examples. They compare their current GDP per capita to the World Bank's high-income threshold, and they look at how long they have before their support ratios hit first-wave levels.
Not a lot of time to work with.
No. And sub-Saharan Africa has more time, but they're starting from a much lower GDP per capita. The climb is steeper. Projections suggest most later-wave countries won't hit high-income status before their support ratios drop to first-wave levels. And even a small growth shortfall could make things much worse.
So they're running against the clock.
In a way, yes. And that demographic dividend, the boost to GDP per capita from having a growing share of working-age folks, that's going to fade in most later-wave regions by 2050, except maybe sub-Saharan Africa, if they can invest heavily in things like education and infrastructure.
Right. They need to capitalize on that window of opportunity.
They do. The report also has this interesting point about global productivity. They say if productivity per hour worked stays constant, but more of those work hours shift to later wave regions because of demographics, global average productivity could drop by 12% by 2050.
Wow, that's a big potential hit.
It is. Really highlights the need for those regions to boost productivity. Now, emerging economies have had mixed success with this. Some are on a fast track, catching up to advanced economies. But many, representing billions of people, are on a slow track or middle track, and they're not converging fast enough at their current pace.
So there's a lot of work to be done.
Definitely. Beyond productivity, there's also the potential to increase labor intensity in later wage regions. In India, for example, a growing working-age population helped boost GDP per capita, but falling labor intensity, partly because of more people in school and stagnant female workforce participation, offset some of those gains.
Right, so they're not fully tapping into their potential workforce.
Not yet. And female labor force participation is generally lower in the median later wave economy compared to the first wave, though there's a big range. The report says a 10 percentage point increase in India's female participation could boost their GDP per capita by 4% to 5%.
So empowering women to work could have a big impact.
It could. And tackling unemployment, underemployment, low productivity jobs, that's crucial too. More capital investment, more jobs in productive sectors. In Brazil, a 4 percentage point increase in their employment to population ratio could raise GDP per capita by almost 9%.
So it's not just about having people, it's about having them in the right jobs.
Exactly. And the report also stresses the